So you've run a hypothesis test, and now your instructor wants you to say whether you reject the null or fail to reject the null. First, let's clarify what each of these options means. The null hypothesis in any hypothesis test states that there is not a significant difference. The alternative hypothesis states some variation of that there is a significant difference. When you reject the null hypothesis, you are saying, no, the null hypothesis is not true. Null hypothesis says there's no significant difference. When you reject it, you take that away. That's not true. And that leaves you with the alternative hypothesis. If you fail to reject the null hypothesis, this is what you're sticking with. This is what you are going to fail to reject. Now, that's the first challenge. The second challenge is remembering to use that terminology, failing to reject, as opposed to accepting the null. Why do we say that we fail to reject the null as opposed to accepting the null? The reason for that is a little bit philosophical, but it's an important philosophical idea. So the scientific philosopher or philosopher of science, Karl Popper, he spoke about this, and he used the famous example, or maybe people just trying to demonstrate his idea, use the example of swans. Now, you can find 100 white swans. You can gather swans from all over, and that's why I'm standing in front of my Salvador Dali poster right there. So you see a white swan. So you can gather a bunch of swans and say, this swan is white, this swan is white, this swan is white, this swan is white, etc. And you'll have a statement about 100 white swans, but you cannot generate conclusively from each of those statements the conclusion that, or the inference that every single white swan in the world is going to be white. You can fail to disprove that statement. You can fail to disprove that there are other kinds of swans, but from simply pointing to a bunch of white swans, you can't say that all swans are white. So if your null hypothesis is there are no swans that are different from white, you can fail to reject that if you gather 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 swans and they're all white, but you can't accept that statement as absolute truth, because all it takes is stumbling across one single black swan. And that's the principle that we go with in hypothesis testing, and that's why we use the terminology failing to reject the null as opposed to accepting the null, because we're leaving open the possibility that maybe our particular study simply did not find the evidence. Maybe we didn't see the one case or the sample that is going to actually show that maybe the null hypothesis is not true. Maybe the alternative hypothesis is true. And we just haven't found that yet. So that's why we fail to reject the null. Scientists are supposed to have a certain amount of humility. And that's why we stick with this wording.